Welcome to the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. I'm Kevin C. Neese.
And I'm Tim Van Orden. And you are listening to episode 1. What is a Gospel According to Star Trek? And since this is our first episode, we are going to be giving you a brief summary of what the podcast concept is, as well as what you can expect in the future.
And then we're going to get into some Star Trek news and a little bit of a survey of how we feel about where Star Trek is right now.
That's right. And we're also going to talk about the first 3 episodes of Lower Decks.
And then we're going to get into our main story, which is answering that big question: what is the Gospel According to Star Trek? We are really glad you're here with us, and let's get started. So this podcast is based on work that really Tim and I have been doing together for a lot of years. I started a thing several years ago called the Undiscovered Country Project, and that was my journey through Star Trek from a Christian worldview perspective. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It's just putting a Christian perspective in conversation with Star Trek. And that means all of Star Trek, which is a big, big project. And in fact, it has always been about these books that I'm writing called The Gospel According to Star Trek. The first one is out. It came out on the 50th anniversary of Star Trek. It's called The Gospel According to Star Trek, The Original Crew. And there will be more books: Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, all that. But there's so much new Star Trek coming out, and we just kind of felt like we needed to be doing more to engage with Star Trek Current, and that's why we have a podcast. And so we're going to be talking about nerd stuff for sure. I mean, and we'll just talk about what's going on in Star Trek and how we feel about it. And then we'll also be carrying on that conversation between Star Trek and a Christian perspective, and we hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, and I just want to say, since this is like the third time we've tried to record this episode, I'll say it again because I really am looking forward to seeing what the Gospel According to Star Trek Lower Decks is going to look like.
Right, and therein lies something really important about what we do, which is I never want to force this stuff. I never want to try to manipulate Star Trek to make it say something, or try to push a conversation about theology or philosophy or whatever where it's just not warranted. And Lower Decks is a comedy series, so not that comedy can't be profound, but it's not that kind of comedy necessarily. Yet, we're only 3 episodes in. But hey, we're getting ahead of ourselves because that's what we're talking about later in the episode. Right, Tim?
That's right.
All right. So
All right.
There you go. So Tim, why are you here? Why are you a part of this?
Well, because I have nothing better to do, really.
Well, I was going to let you speak for yourself, but I should know by now that's always a mistake.
Yeah, it's never wise. As my wife has figured out several years ago.
Yeah, Tim and I have known each other for like about 30 years, and we're good friends, and we both love Star Trek, and we both love Jesus, and we started actually recording stuff together back in the beginning days. Back in 2011, we started doing audio commentaries for Star Trek episodes and films, and that kind of that didn't work out the way we wanted it to, and we've been rethinking things since then, and now we've come to the podcast concept, and we're excited to be doing it. So
Indeed.
Okay, so now it's time for a bit of Star Trek news. Insert Star Trek news sound effect.
This is why I need a soundboard.
Hey, look, man, I can't.
I need
you.
all of our listeners, all 2 of them. I need you to get it trending on Twitter. Hashtag soundboard for Tim.
Yeah, Tim needs a soundboard.
Yes, let's do it. Let's get it done.
Okay. So Star Trek news right now is weird.
I don't even have Twitter.
Star Trek is in a weird place. I don't know what's going on. Do you know what's going on?
You mean like in general? No.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of chaotic at the moment.
Oh, with Star Trek? No, not
Trek.
that either.
I mean, with Star Trek, not just with this podcast, which clearly, Star Trek right now is in a weird space. I don't know what's going on with it. A lot of people don't know what's going on with it. There are a couple things going on. One, Kurtzman has been in charge of Star Trek for a while. Some people are really kind of unhappy with that because there are a lot of detractors for Picard. There are a lot of detractors for Discovery. There are detractors for Short Treks. There are detractors for Lower Decks.
Mm-hmm.
But go ahead.
Now, you know what? It just, I feel like what they're basically doing is like throwing a whole bunch of stuff up against the wall and seeing what sticks.
It does feel that way to a certain extent. Yeah, it does. But it's also like, I don't know. I think the concept of the expanded universe has gotten really big right now.
Oh
Like
yeah,
from the
thank you,
Marvel
Disney.
films, over to Star Wars. Star Wars
Mhm.
is like, we're gonna do more Skywalker saga, and then we're also gonna do these offshoot films, and then we're gonna do we're
Mhm.
gonna do TV series and all this stuff. And so I really think Kurtzman is kind of like dialing in on that, or CBS is kind
Mhm.
of dialing
Yeah,
in on that. And so yeah, the big concern I've had in the Kurtzman era has been how much Star Trek is being produced. At the same time, I've liked everything that's been done.
right. I just, you know what makes me nervous as you say that? It reminds me of like, you know, when Voyager, no,
Mhm.
no, sorry, DS9. DS9 have never had a chance to be its own show, right? And that was to its detriment.
Mhm.
And so I wonder if there's going to be so much Trek out there now, or in this modern binging age of streaming and everything and the internet and everything like that, is that no longer a problem? Is that more of to its strength than a weakness?
See, I think that's the thinking going into it, that we're not competing for eyeballs every week, right?
Hmm.
But of course, CBS isn't doing streaming like Netflix does. They don't drop a whole season all at once. So people
Right,
aren't going to binge, right? They
right.
can't binge unless they wait till the end of the
Hmm.
of the season. The seasons are shorter, which is good. I've said for years,
Hmm.
like if the original series had the same amount of production budget and the same amount of time to produce its episodes, but half the episode order, we'd have a stronger series for the original series, and for a lot of series, because 26 episodes is a lot,
Right.
you know, and the crunch is really tight. The way network television was done for all those years. So television production is different. Television distribution is different, and there's a sense in which you don't have to compete because they can still air them one at a time, right? They're
Hmm.
not overlapping them. Like in the old days when we were talking about Deep Space Nine and Next Generation and Voyager, like all being on well,
Oh,
Next
that's
Generation,
true. Yeah,
the
that's
three
that's
of them
true.
weren't all at the same time, except that Next Generation was in reruns.
Right, right,
But you had Deep Space Nine and Voyager who were both on at the same time,
right,
and I don't remember how it was in the weekly schedule, but it wasn't just one Star Trek episode per week. It was like
right.
it was
That's
at
true.
least two, maybe three,
Hmm.
and then the movie was happening and all that kind of stuff. So
Right.
it got really crazy, especially that year that we saw the end of Next Generation, the continuation of Deep Space Nine, the beginning of Voyager, and Generations,
Right.
like all at the same time. That was kind of when I stepped out, honestly, because it was my senior year of high school, and I was like, I can't handle all this Star Trek. I can't keep up with it. And we didn't have
You can't
DVRs and
handle
stuff.
the
I
Trek.
can't handle the track. Right. So yeah, I mean, I've been a little concerned about that, but I don't think it's absolute chaos. Like, I think Discovery's really finding its legs. I really enjoyed the first season of Picard, and we'll talk about Lower Decks in just a minute too.
Mhm.
But I generally I have good feelings about Lower Decks. But I found this article on Giant Freaking Robot, and actually a friend sent it to me, and this guy is talking about how chaotic all of Star Trek is. And the other thing that's adding the chaos, I mean, we had the pandemic, right? That threw a wrench in everybody's production
Sure,
schedules.
sure.
And Strange New Worlds, of course, is coming up, which Strange New Worlds
Oh
is awesome.
yes, I'm
Oh,
looking
I'm
forward to that.
so excited about Strange New Worlds.
I love Pike.
um I love Pike too. I loved Pike before he was Anson Mount, but now that he's Anson Mount, I love
Yes.
him like maybe twice as much. um but so this guy is talking, he's even going back and talking about sort of like how uh Kelvin timeline films are in flux,
Oh right, yeah,
you
that's what it
know,
was. Okay.
because there was going to be a Star Trek 4, and of course we lost Anton
Mhm.
Yelchin, and then there was all this dispute with contracts and stuff with Chris Pine and Chris Hemsworth, and that fourth movie just kind of fell apart. But there has been, not just has there been a director who had an idea for a whole new cast and a whole new story, which has been indefinitely suspended, read probably scrapped, because once you indefinitely suspend a project and the people go off to do something else, in movies that almost never ends up, they come back to the same project and that project happens. Usually
Right.
that project dissolves just
Yeah,
because of the way
that's
things
right.
function. But apparently there are like a couple of other ideas for movies that have been floating around. Of course, there's a Tarantino project that's been talked about, which I really hope doesn't happen.
Oh no.
Yeah. And so this person's really drawing on and talking about how much chaos there is. And of course, now that CBS and Viacom have remerged, right? So
Mhm.
we don't have two Star Treks, movie Star Trek and series Star Trek. They're now all kind of under one roof. This guy is saying that, oh, well, the scuttlebutt is that this new person, what is it, Emma Watts, in charge of Paramount, or might fire Alex Kurtzman, and
Oh.
Discovery season 3 might be their last season. There may not be a season 2 of Picard. All this kind of stuff.
Oh my goodness.
That is a ton of speculation, and I have no idea, where that sits in terms of reality.
Well, now that you've said it, this is the internet, and so people are going to say it as if it's fact.
Exactly. But yeah, so it's crazy that this, but of course that's all hypothetically possible. But then it's funny because the person who writes this article is then like, and then there's Lower Decks, which is created by Mike. I don't know if it's McMahon or McMahon, but anyway, is Lower Decks, made by series creator Mike McMahon or McMahon, with virtually no
Oh goodness.
interference from Kurtzman, who's an executive producer on it. Who knows on what authority he has that Kurtzman isn't that involved. But his whole thesis here is Mike from Lower Decks has created, with Lower Decks, the best Star Trek in decades.
Wait, what?
That's what he says. Mike gets Star Trek, and he's proved that with Lower Decks. This is the best Star Trek in decades, and he needs to be in charge of Star Trek. Fire Alex Kurtzman.
No. No.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Like, I think people are stuck. Every time there's new Trek, people are stuck, but the internet has given them a much bigger megaphone this time.
Yeah. What do you mean by stuck?
Well, like stuck in the previous iteration, right? Like TNG came along and it wasn't TOS, so
right.
And then Deep Space Nine came along, and boy, was that polarizing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, and then let's not get into Enterprise.
Right.
So yeah, every time we get new Trek, people get stuck in the previous iteration, and I think Lower Decks, and we might as well segue into Lower Decks here.
Segue.
Lower Decks, I think, does pay more homage to
Next Generation.
To Next Generation. It tries to capture that feeling, kind of the same way that the Orville does, but much better. The Orville is much better.
The Orville does a better job. I agree.
And they're just not.
Lower Decks has the fonts. That's the thing. It's those opening title and end credit fonts that get us all nostalgic. That's what it's all about.
Well, and the uniforms and the ship design, and it's absolutely, it's all designed to. And I read something. Well, no, that's getting way off topic. But so I think, well, no, it was just a lot of things. It seems like a lot of shows and series are starting to rely on that nostalgia factor a little too much. And Rise of Skywalker was a big example of that, which you haven't seen, so I'm not going to go into details.
Thanks. Also, it's the wrong franchise, so.
No, I know, but that's what I was saying.
I've already brought up Star Wars once.
Kind of getting out into left field here, but
yeah. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a lot of leaning on that nostalgia button, and that can be a good thing, and that can be a bad thing. It depends on how you do it. And I actually talk about this in a blog post that you can read by me on Real World Theology, Actually, if you go to kevinseenies.com and you go to writings and you go to web, it's listed there. But if you go to realworldtheology.com, there's a series of posts on Picard, and I did the episode Nepenthe, which was pretty much everybody's favorite episode from the season, which I was really happy about the fact that I got to do that. But I talk about that. I talk about how that episode uses nostalgia really, really well, right? And I think that's something that the people behind Star Trek Picard did really well. But yeah, but I think Lower Decks does too. I think Lower Decks,
right, and that's why, to my point, that's why I think people are saying there's this. I don't know how big of an internet faction there is, but at least this one guy is saying that Mike McMahon, Mike Mack needs to be in charge of Star Trek because he's giving them that nostalgia factor. He's giving them that old Star Trek that they're used to, that comfortable blanket, instead of letting Star Trek grow into what it needs to be for the current generation of viewers.
Right. I completely agree with that. I think this assessment that this fella, I don't know this person who wrote this article at all, obviously. And I don't know what their motivation or ideas, but yeah, I mean, I feel like they feel like TNG is the ultimate Star Trek, and this feels more like TNG than anything else. But it's also so far afield of anything we would have in TNG in terms of the humor and the absurdity and the chaos, you know. And that. Okay, so and that brings us to, I think, our discussion of so Star Trek. Just to put a button on the news bit. Star Trek is in a weird place. I don't know what's going on, but I have felt in all this time that I've been watching Kurtzman Trek, right? I have felt that this is the best time to be a Star Trek fan since like the 20th anniversary era, like the middle section, the really good section of the Berman era, you know, where there's tons of Star Trek. I like this is the best time to be a Star Trek fan since then. I think Star Trek is so much fun right now because it's so diverse, and I'm so excited by it.
I will absolutely agree with everything you have to say there, but it just makes me, now I know talking about that nostalgia factor, but it just makes me yearn. There was a Star Trek customizable card game made by Decipher, and oh man, it was back during the Magic the Gathering craze. And oh man, I just loved that game, and that to me was the best time to be a Star Trek fan because that game was awesome. But I digress. So Lower Decks.
Well, I thought you were going somewhere with that.
No, nowhere at all. It just reminded me of the card game and how much I miss it.
Well, you know what I miss? I miss the Star Trek VHS game.
Oh man, that was horrible.
With Robert O'Reilly.
I can't believe.
With Robert O'Reilly saying "Experience Beige." Anyway, sorry.
Oh my gosh.
Moving on. Yeah. So next point. I mean, that's kind of it. Star Trek's in an interesting place. We'll see where it goes from here, but we'll be talking more about Picard and Discovery and all that. But right now, Lower Decks is on. Recap for our listeners, Tim.
Great.
I know we've talked about this a couple of times because we've had difficulty getting
technical difficulties
making these episodes. So we're coming into this much vaunted 23 weeks of new Star Trek on All Access, a couple of weeks late, 3 weeks late, whatever. But Tim, give our listeners a little rundown of kind of how you felt going into Discovery. I mean, not Discovery, but Lower Decks.
Lower Decks. Gosh, you know what? It's gonna. So it was barely on my radar before we started watching it. It was just one of those things where I heard they were making a cartoon version and that they were aiming it at kids, and I just kind of I had basically just written it off. And then I saw the trailer for it about a week before the first episode. That was the first time I'd seen a trailer or even given it another second's thought. And I laughed at the trailer. The trailer was hilarious. I showed it to my wife and she was like, did someone give the keys to Star Trek TNG to what's his name?
Seth MacFarlane.
Seth MacFarlane, thank you. Seth MacFarlane, and that's exactly the tone that I got from the trailer. I'm like, so they're just trying to do their own version of Orville, I guess. But yeah, so I saw it, and I was a little bit more excited and hopeful for it. So that's where I was going into it. I think you weren't quite as high after watching the trailer.
I was excited before I watched the trailer.
Right.
I was starting to get hopeful because I saw the character designs and stuff, and I was like, you know what, this could be good.
Sure, and
I like funny Star Trek.
And you also you come off of a really good experience with the original animated series.
Yeah,
and I've only seen 2 or 3, and it's for some reason I just haven't been able to get into the animated series.
It's it's a particular style, it's a particular era, it's a particular thing. It's weird, but I like it. I don't like all of it. Some of the animated series contains some of the best Star Trek I've seen and some of the worst Star Trek I've seen. And that's, I can say that about, about TNG as well and TOS as well, but, so I like animated Star Trek. I like funny Star Trek. So I was kind of, I was getting excited, and then I saw the trailer, and I didn't think it was very funny at all. I didn't think, well, that was a little bit funny, but not real funny. And then also, like, my whole thing going into Star Trek Lower Decks is, okay, there are 4 words in this title. What is this series gonna do to earn the first 2? Like, how is this still gonna be Star Trek? It's great that it's funny, but how's it still going to be Star Trek? And I wanted like some humanity. I wanted some purpose. I wanted some big ideas and all that. And, the first podcast episode that we recorded, that one of the reasons we didn't put it out, aside from literal technical difficulties, was that we stopped the podcast in the middle to go watch the episode and then come back and say what we thought about it. And that didn't go so well.
Oh my gosh. It was like someone had just kicked his puppy.
Yeah, right. I felt gutted. I hated it so much. And I literally, I was having trouble keeping myself like buoyant and host-like for the rest of the episode. I was like, man, this just sucked. And you felt pretty much the same way, right?
I wouldn't say I was as down on it as you were. I was struggling to find something good to say about it.
Yeah.
I will say that, but
so I was really hoping for some big ideas, for some humanity, something like that, And the first episode was entirely devoid of that for me.
Right.
I didn't think it was funny at all. I thought it was really chaotic and noisy and over the top, and like it was kind of like, oh, if we just dance around and shout, you'll think it's funny if we keep doing it long enough, and like, no, I didn't. And I think I was more upset about the fact that it wasn't funny than anything else, but I also was kind of hoping that we'd have some semblance of what Star Trek means, right?
Right.
In the episode, and we just didn't. And it was just, I just felt like it was a complete disaster.
Right. But fortunately, the second episode, we stuck with it. We gave it another try, and the second episode redeemed itself.
The second episode was like a complete turnaround, which is crazy because it's just tweaking the same formula. It's just, like I have always said, Star Trek stands or falls on the writing. It's almost universally well acted, almost universally well produced in every respect. There's almost always everything on the production end is good. Not always, but almost always. At least the best we can get, right? And it stands or falls on the writing. And I mean, that's probably true of cinema in general.
Right.
But that episode was so much better. So much better because it was legitimately funny. I thought
it did have good funny moments. It had heart.
Yeah, and the story was tighter, and there was just more room to breathe in there. That's weird that I say those two things together. That doesn't sound right, but I just felt like there was so much trying to be crammed into the first episode.
Yeah,
and it was so frenetic.
I wonder if that first episode wouldn't have benefited from being an hour-long 2-parter.
I thought that myself. I have thought that myself, that it could have been like a 45-minute show instead of a 25-minute show.
Because it was just vomit.
Yes.
But Mariner especially, but she's gotten better.
Oh yeah.
I've noticed each episode she's gotten a little more tame, a little less crazy, and in this third episode she was just fine.
Yeah.
I like
Well,
the character.
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I like the character. She wasn't like loud and in your face the whole time, and it
Mhm.
wasn't constantly about her. And I mean, there was still some character development for her, and um, yeah, it was just a much more acceptable, or not acceptable, but I don't know what
Accessible.
accessible. Thank you. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, yeah.
Accessible version.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I felt like she was really, I feel like the characters in general were starting to be like softened and humanized in the second episode. Like at the end of the second episode,
Mhm.
I got a little misty on me. I was like,
Right.
hey, this is sweet. This is
Mhm.
really sweet. And that's what I wanted, right?
Right.
I wanted it to be genuinely funny. I wanted to be able to follow what's going on, right? Instead of just the chaos and noise of the first episode. And I wanted there to be some humanity in these characters. And so that was great. The second episode, I was like, yes, now I'm a fan. And so now we have the third episode, and I really liked it. Did you enjoy it?
I did actually. Yeah, I didn't. I didn't find much of it as funny as the second episode,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I enjoyed it.
I thought I love the arena scene where
Oh yes, the two-handed fighting. Yes. And but you see though, that's one of those things that's going to be a lot funnier
to a
for
nerd.
the nostalgia factor. For those
Yeah,
of us that are used to seeing Kirk and Riker fighting with the double fisted or the two
yeah.
fist technique,
The two fists punch, whatever that
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
Yeah. No, it was great. And of course he rips his shirt off and everything.
right.
Glorious. That was so funny. I loved it. And I loved that Mariner kind of got taken down a peg,
Mhm.
and got kind of taught some stuff instead of just being so cocky all the time. And
Right. Yeah, that second was it? No, the first episode. She was a little bit of a Mary Sue. Like
yeah,
everything.
yeah,
What
everything
like
revolves around her.
yeah, she knew exactly what to do. She
Yeah,
was always right.
yeah, yeah. No, I agree with you. And I think that's great. I think it was great for the character.
Mhm.
Um, and and I loved, like the sort of I don't know which is the B story and which is the A story in this episode, but but back on the Cerritos, when everything's going insane because the captain is trying so hard to put the screws on everything, right?
Mhm.
And sort of the outcome of that story feels like sort of a thematic thrust of the episode. And maybe it's a thrust of both stories, honestly, which is letting go of control a little bit, right?
Mhm.
Like she's just like her mom, trying to control everything, in her story.
Yeah,
Not
it's
even largely in
interesting.
charge.
She's
Yeah.
she's trying to control everything to be out of control.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. She's trying to impose her chaos.
Right.
Right. And then where her mom is just trying to impose like all this extreme order, but you can see how they're related in that regard.
Yeah.
And 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 it's obviously it's comedy, so everything's exaggerated, right?
Right.
But when we get to the end and we have the Boimler effect,
Mhm.
right? I thought it really said something about good leadership, and it said something about good about how you need to imbue any rule structure that you have with humanity, with room for humanity, with
Mhm.
room for humans to be humans, both in their limitations and their abilities for excellence, right? Because
Mhm.
when you give people room to breathe, you give them room to grow, right? And when you give them the right encouragement, you don't have to put the screws on them from like this top down thing. You can encourage them to be the best they can be. And I think that's great. I I felt like it went a little too far, with that, because the captain at the end is like, okay, Boimler, do whatever you feel like. And I'm like, okay, maybe that's safe to say with Boimler, because what Boimler feels like doing is every single job that needs to be done on the ship.
Sure.
He's gonna
And
be
well,
awesome at it.
and like what he feels like doing is the job to the best of his ability. And
Right.
for him, the best of his ability is to constantly be doing it.
Right.
And like I feel like if you apply that Boimler effect to people in general, it's allowing each one of them the space to do the job to the best of their ability.
Right. And like, right. But if you just say, like, I felt it went a little too far towards saying that the ethic, like the lesson for today, kids, is no rules, do what you feel like is the best way to do things.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I guarantee you that's not how their writers room runs. I guarantee you that's not how their animation department runs, right?
Right.
Like I'm sure they have a lot of freedom. I mean, they're animators and they're writers, come on, but at the same time, they do have deadlines,
Sure.
right? And they do have standards that they have to meet, broadcast standards and things
Maybe
like
this was a protest episode.
that. Maybe so. Maybe they're like, get off our back, CBS.
A cry for help.
Maybe so. But it reminded me of the TNG episode Justice.
Mm-hmm.
And that line that I keep coming back to over and over at the end of that episode, something I've kind of pondered and messed with for a long time, is Picard saying at the end of that episode, there can be no justice so long as laws are absolute. And I think that rubs a lot of Christians the wrong way.
Which is funny, because as we were talking about this before the episode, it reminded me of this absolutely, to me, it's one of my guiding quotes by Thomas, and I'm not going to say his last name right, Aquinas. Yeah. Mercy without justice is the mother of dissolution. Justice without mercy is cruelty.
Preach.
And
exactly. And I think justice without mercy, or let's put it a little differently, but like rules without conscience, right? Mm-hmm. Rules without humanity, right, is what we saw in this episode.
Right.
And that's what we see in Justice too, in the episode Justice. And that relationship of justice and mercy, like, that's a very Christian idea. That's a very Jewish idea. Like, I think it's a very human idea. I think it's a very essential concept, that you can't stick to the rules so stringently that you don't leave room for what the rules are meant to accomplish. Right? Which I think is what we saw in the episode, where like the captain is so interested in making the ship run well, that she's holding everybody to a standard they can't possibly meet. Mm-hmm. And putting, because if you put the wrong time limit on jobs, and you can't allow your people to adapt to what things actually need, like, because the fact that there is buffer time, right? Mm-hmm. You can sometimes use buffer time to do a job that takes a little longer too. Like, there's at one point where I don't know all their names yet. So Cyborg Kid is like, I've got 10 minutes to do a 30-minute, job or whatever, Mm-hmm. So it starts to work the other way on you. And so I found that really good. I found that really refreshing and really right.
Right.
And go ahead.
And well, no, I was just going to segue us into the next subject, because we're a little over time. Okay. And that, because we haven't talked about religion all that much, and so with this first kind of Christian perspective here, that leads us right into naturally into our main point for this episode, which is what is the gospel according to Star Trek, and how is it going to apply? What are we even trying to do with this? Are we taking these religious ideas, or these philosophies from someone like Thomas Aquinas, and are we going to try and shoehorn them in? Are we, what are we doing here? Are we trying to make Star Trek Christian?
No. There, we're done.
Good answer. All right.
Very
So
much.
thanks for being with us, guys. Today's sponsor is I have no idea.
Yeah. Today's sponsor is brevity.
I
No,
was about to say that, but then I thought it
were
would
you
be
really?
but then I thought it would be a lame joke, so I didn't.
I love how it's both validating and backhanded. I appreciate that greatly.
That's what I'm here for, man.
Oh my goodness. But yeah, no, so yeah, I mean, you see me working with it a little bit right there. I mean, it just the lower decks just kind of brought it up. Brings up something that is relevant to, to trying to live life well, from a Christian perspective. I mean, as a person who does my best to follow Jesus, like, you know, I came into Star Trek. I came into Star Trek, when I was a teenager, and I was a big fan and everything. But like I was talking about earlier, I kind of got away from it. And while I was away from it, I started college, and I started taking courses in philosophy. And I started taking my first philosophy course from my mentor, my philosophy professor, Dr. David Noggle. And it changed, from the first class. It changed my view of my education. It changed my view of everything that I was doing, to not only see that education was about forming me as a human being, but also that intellectual pursuits were necessarily spiritual pursuits, and that so that like intellectual formation is a part of spiritual formation. They're not separate. And that not separateness applies to everything, that like God is at work everywhere, and those things that that I see that are valuable and are good. I mean, like goodness is good because God is good. Truth is true because God is true. Beauty is beautiful because God is beautiful. So all goodness is God's goodness. All truth is God's truth. All beauty is God's beauty. So wherever you see those things, you need to pay attention.
It makes me the first part of your story there. I don't know how many times I've heard you tell me that, tell others that.
Yeah.
I read it in your book, I think. But this is the first time that it kind of sounded to me like a lot of people's Christian walks, where they're into it and they're a fan, and then they get away from it for a while, and then they have an experience that gives them a deeper understanding, and they get back into it and they see it everywhere. But
Right.
that also, because we want this podcast to be to appeal to a wide audience, to Christians and non-Christians alike.
Yeah.
There are probably, hopefully, there might be some listeners right now that are getting a little uncomfortable with this line of conversation. So I want to ask you, is your intent here to backdoor convert people? Are you trying to bait and switch and get people here? Is this whole gospel according to Star Trek designed to win more souls for heaven?
If anything I do in my life ever makes anybody think that Jesus is worth following, that's fantastic. But I'm not here trying to like manipulate Star Trek to kind of promote religion or promote a religion. I think that's one of the things that some Star Trek people have kind of assumed that I'm doing, and that's not it at all. I actually am talking like I actually am talking more about how Star Trek helps me to be a better Christian, which is not separate from being a better human being, right?
Right.
Like those things should go together. And so I feel like that makes a lot of what I'm saying hopefully relevant to a lot of people. And, I hope people can, because as a Christian coming into Star Trek, right, I saw it two different ways. I saw people say, okay, Star Trek is this bastion of humanism on television and film or whatever, and I'm going to reject that because humanism doesn't have anything to do with Christianity, which is false. But anyway, that's their
That's a whole
thing.
nother podcast.
Yeah, that's their thing. Like, that's humanistic, that's anti-religious, whatever. I'm not going to watch it. Or they would just feel guilty for liking it. and because they believe that line, that like they have nothing in common, so why would you watch it? um and I felt like there had to be another way, and that way is that, like I'm talking about, I mean, I see so much in Star Trek that is so good and so life affirming and so humanity affirming. And I really believe, like, I really the more I question and the more I explore and the more I puzzle and the more I consider various philosophical and theological viewpoints, the more I really believe that, the gospel matters, and that it is something that fulfills who we are as human beings. And if that's true, then when we discuss deeply what it means to be human, we ought to find ourselves bumping up against the gospel. And I think we do. And so I'm just talking about that conversation. I'm talking about that intersection, because I think sometimes those of us who are Christians, like, if we can start to see that God is at work everywhere, in all of our human endeavors, especially in our creative efforts, and even when we're unaware, if we can start to see that all goodness is God's goodness, all truth is God's truth, all beauty is God's beauty, then I think we can start to understand and converse with things better, to know why we love the things we love, right? That there's something good, something truly good in there. And then also, I think for other people who may not be Christians at all or whatever, I hope that if you care about the things that are important in Star Trek, and you see me as somebody who loves and tries to follow Jesus, like saying, yeah, those are the things that I care about too, maybe that will help rescue, like, I want to help rescue your view of Christianity from where religion has taken it. And then I also want to help Christians rescue their view of humanity from really where religion has taken that too. So yeah. And when I say religion, I don't mean all religion, but the oppressive kind, like in Return of the Archons. So yeah, that's where that stands.
So as I was reading your book, The Gospel According to Star Trek, I really appreciated from a Christian perspective, I appreciated a lot about what you had to say, and I felt like it was fair, in the sense that it wasn't like all these good things are Christian, therefore Christianity is good. You were critical of Christianity at some points, where Star Trek can show us how we can do better. So maybe for our listeners, just kind of dive into the book a little bit and kind of go into some of the chapters and what exactly you're going for. What are you trying to access?
Okay, yeah. The thing about Star Trek that I love is that it comments on all these things that are important to me and to most Christians, right? From a Christian perspective, I mean, they're important to everybody, but I mean, I'm coming at it from a Christian perspective because that's my worldview, right? And that's the worldview, that's the culture that I think I can speak to and speak from. So I hope that's helpful to people. But as it talks about these things, it just gives me an opportunity to look at a different perspective and to see things. I think it's interesting to look at people who may completely disagree with you and try to figure out, what they have to say that's of value, because often they do have things to say of value, but you're too busy pushing them away because they fit into a certain category. So Gene Roddenberry, well known as an atheist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I went into this whole project believing that line, believing that story, but still seeing these things in Star Trek. And so I got really interested in who Gene Roddenberry was, what his worldview was, what his actual religious beliefs were, and everything. And as I started to research that, I started finding that the image of Gene Roddenberry I had didn't match up with what I was finding in the things that he said and the things that he wrote. And so I really did this deep dive, and that's where the book starts out. I spend 4 chapters talking about Roddenberry and trying to pin down as best I could, with the resources I have available to me, as best I could, his theology. which he did have a theology. He was not an atheist, nor was he like a traditional monotheist or a Christian. Definitely wasn't, and definitely had a strong distaste for religion. But I think he had a distaste for religion because, like a lot of people, because of negative religious experiences in his life and questions that he had that he felt religion couldn't answer, perspectives that he had that he felt religion couldn't touch. Like, I feel like he felt like he had a higher view of God than the religion that he grew up with did. And
Mhm.
honestly, I think he's not wrong about that.
Right. I think that's a common complaint today. What drives a lot of people away from the church.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I think Christian religion is often, well, like we've talked about with the Lower Decks episode, it's often about sort of like dotting the I's and crossing the T's and everybody fitting all the categories correctly and not leaving room for mystery and chaos and humanity and all these things that we run into and conversation with other beliefs and other worldviews. Christianity, it's very hard to say anything very broadly about Christian religion or faith or whatever because it's so diverse.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, in the West, in our culture, in the last 50 years or so, at least, and maybe in the last 500 years, Christianity has tended to stumble in that area, tended to be really difficult to have conversations. So to take somebody whose worldview a lot of Christians would look at and just push away and say, well, that's pagan, that's pantheist, that's humanist, whatever, and just push that away, forgetting that there's such a thing as Christian humanism, forgetting that God really is bigger than anything you conceive. I believe it's Anselm who said, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? So that's big and that's huge. And a lot of theology, I think, works too hard to sort of put the screws on God to say this is how this is why Christianity splinters so much, because people try to define things so narrowly and so specifically that they start to have big disagreements over things that aren't essential. And they go off and they say, well, then we're not going to be in fellowship with you anymore. We're going to break off and we're going to go over here. And they've been doing that over and over and over for centuries. And Roddenberry, being in conversation with Roddenberry's views on religion, which were very negative, I don't know. I mean, he would give some assent to the idea that maybe there's some beneficial religion somewhere. Maybe there are some intelligent religious people somewhere. But generally what he said was religion kind of functions as, people use it as a substitute brain. In other words, they let religion think for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that as a substitute brain, religion does not function well. And he's absolutely spot on that. And so a lot of his critiques of religion, I mentioned earlier the episode Return of the Archons. So a lot of that kind of stuff that's in Christianity, in Star Trek, I think Christians should agree with or should recognize or should take note of, because those criticisms are correct. They're not wrong. People are very, very harmed by religion, the way we practice it. And so Star Trek really points that out. But that episode, Return of the Archons, is one of the episodes that I kind of pop out in my original series section. So after I do Roddenberry, I go to the original series, and I don't do a deep dive in the original series. That's another reason we have the podcast, because you can talk about episode by episode by episode by episode, and you can come up with all sorts of cool things to talk about. But what I looked for was some broad general themes. So I'm like, how does Star Trek deal with God and religion and faith? How does Star Trek deal with paradise and Eden imagery? How does Star Trek deal with scripture? Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to interject a side note here. When I saw that episode in the second season of Discovery, which you've seen, you've seen all the Discovery.
Discovery.
That in the second season, that Eden episode.
Yeah.
I saw that and I'm like, oh man, Kevin is gonna love this. This is vintage classic Star Trek right here.
Right. But that's the thing though, right? Like I didn't go looking for Eden imagery because I was like, I need to find Eden imagery in Star Trek.
Right.
I'm just watching Star Trek and I'm like, man, they talk about Eden a lot.
Yeah.
Like, man, they talk about Genesis and Adam and Eve all through original crew stuff. The book is the original crew. So I don't just stick with the original series. We go all the stuff with Kirk and company. And yeah, all the way up through Star Trek 6. Star Trek 6 has a reference to Eden when Spock has a painting of the expulsion from Eden on his wall in his quarters on the Enterprise. Like, Spock has a Bible painting.
Yeah.
It's Mark Chagall, so it's it's so that thread was something I was really interested in following. So I just kind of picked those things up and just discuss them. And so I talk about various episodes within the original series and cover those things and just ask, what is Star Trek saying in Bread and Circuses? What is Star Trek saying in Return of the Archons, or in This Side of Paradise, or any of these other episodes that I feel like can give me a window into, like, I use Return of the Archons as sort of an archetype for how Star Trek deals with religion.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like just about every religion critical episode of Star Trek from there on follows a very similar pattern, a similar structure, which is basically that religion should be soul enriching, not soul killing. And that a lot of religion, in an effort to, again, like we talked about, put the screws on it, right? Put so many rules down to try to preserve something that they don't leave it room to breathe, and they miss the essence. Jesus talked about this. Jesus talked about the religious leaders in his day. You're like, you'll strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Saying like you keep the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law is so far from you. Like, your hearts are so far from God because you're so interested in following all the little details of the law, which, by the way, people have written, over and above what was given to Moses. You're trying to be so assiduous and so religious, you've forgotten how to live according to the spirit of the law, and why the law is there, which is, to make you fuller, richer humans, better loving humans, who love and are in communion with God. That's that's the point. And so anyway, we talk about that sort of stuff. I go through the animated series and talk about several episodes in there. We get a little history lesson on the Salem witch trials with with one of the episodes, and just kind of drawing out, well, here's again Star Trek dealing with gods and religion, and those are the easy places to grab stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But another aim for me and another goal for me is to look at where Star Trek is not talking about God, where Star Trek is not talking about religion, but is talking about things that are important. And how does it talk about those things? In the original crew, there's probably a little more stuff that deals directly with religion than maybe in some other areas of Star Trek. And so that pops up a lot more just because that's what's in there, right? But I get into the movies and I start talking. I give each movie a chapter, and I just talk about what's going on in that film and what themes are being discussed, and I put those in conversation with my Christian worldview, and I say, well, this is where it connects, this is where it deviates, but here's what I see that's good in here, here's what I see that's true in here, here's what I see that's beautiful in here, and talk about that movie by movie. And then, sometimes in Star Trek there are things that are not intended to be taken the way I take them. You can do metaphorical readings of Star Trek and get some really interesting things. So in Star Trek 2, 3, and 4, and yes, I'm including Star Trek 4, Spock becomes a Christ figure. And those people who are familiar with Star Trek 2 and 3 know kind of the basic reason that Star Trek, that Spock reflects Jesus. But when you start with that and you say, okay, this guy is gonna be Jesus in these movies, and you start pulling on those threads, there's all sorts of symbolism in those films that's totally not intentional. But surprisingly, I can use Star Trek 2, 3, and 4 to give you a pretty good lesson in Christology, to give you a pretty good saying of the actual gospel, like the actual story of Jesus. And why is that there if it's not intended? How did that get there? Is it because somebody sneaked it in? Is it because that stuff is sort of floating around in our culture and just sort of happened in because people connected dots they didn't realize they were connecting? Is it because God was doing something miraculous in the making of those films? Is it because I just saw that stuff because I have the lenses with which to see it, and God did something miraculous through that, at least in me? Yeah, it's probably all those things to one degree or another.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not going to try to delineate that so carefully and so tightly and say, "Oh, look, Star Trek is secretly Christian." No, it's not. You know, if anything, there's a lot of Jewish influence in particularly original series and in those movies. There's a ton of Jewish influence in those films, but that's that's relevant to a Christian worldview as well. So yeah, and then going on and talking about issues of peacemaking and all kinds of other things in those films, and then going on into the Kelvin timeline as well, and talking about issues like free will and determinism, and talking about issues of how we maintain our humanity and respond to people who hurt us, right? And how we grow and mature into who we're going to be, and how we live into a calling even when it's hard and that day-to-day mundaneness. I mean, those kind of are three big points in the three of those movies, and because that's what those movies talk about. And so I talk about how that I put that in conversation with Scripture. I put that in conversation with a Christian worldview, and that's just what I do. And I've done it in that original Crew book, and I'm working on the Next Generation book, and we're just gonna keep working through, keep having the conversation.
I am excited to hear you say that last part about working on the Next Generation book. I thoroughly enjoyed the original series, and I am very much looking forward to the Next Generation. Hopefully, everything that you just shared with our listener is enough to whet his or her appetite. Are we going to have like a little description or something that we can include a link in as to where they can buy the book if they're interested?
Yeah.
Okay, so gentle listeners, look in our description.
Look at our description. You can
I'm
you can go to gospelaccordingtostartrek.com. You can go to kevincneese.com. You can search Gospel According to Star Trek on Amazon or on Barnes and Noble, or go support your local bookseller.
Yes,
especially right now.
absolutely. Well, don't go. See if they have an online website first.
Right. Do it online. Do it safely. Don't just walk in. Right.
Indiebooks.com, I think, is a good website that collects a lot of independent booksellers.
Okay. Great. Yeah, that's great. I mean, because local businesses are really suffering right now, particularly, and so wait a couple weeks. Have them special order it. It'll take longer than Amazon, but the book's 4 years old. Yeah. You'll get to it.
And it's worth the read. Like, no matter what your viewpoint is, if you like Star Trek, this book is worth a read. And obviously, I'm biased, but I thoroughly enjoyed it.
You're biased, but you happen to agree with a fella who said, "Don't be scared off by the title, Trek fans. Whether Christian, pagan, atheist, or any other corner on the global higher power scale, you'll find plenty of new insights into the human adventure amid the dots Kevin Sinise connects in the Gospel According to Star Trek, the original Crew. Kevin looks at Star Trek's love-hate relationship with paradises, God things, baby steps humanity, alien deities, and even the wacky implications of the animated series, and finds something to intrigue everyone." And those words are on the back of the book from a man named Larry Nemeczek. God bless him. Who
now you're
very kindly offered me that endorsement. So
now you're just patting yourself on the back there.
Yeah, now that was a total. That wasn't even a humble brag. That was just a brag, people.
I mean, you get Larry Nemeczek to say something like that about your book. Yeah, I would be sharing that too.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it.
That's yeah.
Cool. But Larry's a great guy and just has been so kind to me and let me help him with some of his stuff too, and was super kind to give me that endorsement. But I quote that really just to say, here it is from Dr. Trek himself, and please check out Trekland and Portal 47. But here it is from Dr. Trek himself saying, "Hey guys, I like what he says at the beginning, like, don't be scared off by the title." I mean, I think that's the best thing somebody can say about the book, is that I hope people aren't scared off by the title. I hope people do come and have a conversation with me. And if you got questions or objections, send them to me because I want to hear them.
Absolutely. So is every episode going to be a 30-minute advertisement for your book?
No. That was it. We'll talk about the books as they come out. We'll talk about, and we'll dive into things that are in the book when we don't have brand new, fresh Star Trek to talk about, which we will for at least the next 20 weeks. We'll dive into some stuff that's in the book for sure.
Right.
But no, I'm not here just to plug the book. We're talking about the book so that you get an idea of what the whole project is and give a little bit of flavor of what we're going to be doing in the podcast.
And now this is where you ask me, so what are we going to be doing next week?
Now, how would you know I was going to say that?
I've got an outline. You told me what to say.
You are making this out like we planned this stuff, Tim.
This is
to be all improv.
This is just the third time we've done it is all.
So, Tim, what is coming up on the schedule for next week? Please tell me.
Well, looks like we're going to be covering the next episode of Lower Decks. And we're also going to start talking about Discovery, which I am very excited to get into.
Yeah.
Just as a little bit of a taste, I don't want you to actually answer the question now, but I want to ask you about the fact that, there are so many people out there who say that Discovery isn't Star Trek, and that because Star Trek is about us being at our best, and what happens when we take that and encounter other cultures and other civilizations. And I think there's a deeper meaning to Star Trek about what it means to be human, and I think Discovery really dives into that. So I think Discovery is Star Trek, and I think that's going to be something for us to really dive into next week because there's a lot to talk about with Discovery. And also, if anyone has any questions for us or anything else that they want to say, did you already give out your email?
No, I'm going to tell you right now. You can email me at gospeltrekpodcast@gmail.com. You can email me there. You can email me at kevin@gospelaccordingtostartrek.com if you feel like typing that much.
That's a mouthful, and I can't remember that.
You can go to the website and click the contact button. You can get on my email list. You'll get a free sample of my book. You'll get that whole big old Roddenberry section when you sign up for my e-newsletter.
All 4 chapters? Are you serious?
Yeah, you do. You get the whole, you get the first 30 pages or something of the book. So yeah, it's really generous. My publisher puts that out, and you get that if you sign up for my email list. And you can really get a taste of the book. And you can also catch me on the Twitter. You can catch me on the Facebook and all that stuff. I'm out there.
On the Twitter
machine. But send us your questions.
Please do, because I am not great at asking questions, as you've no doubt discovered.
I think
please send us your questions.
Yeah, please send us your questions. Absolutely, because I'd love to be able to answer anything that comes in. That's it. So I'm excited. I hope you'll join us. And Tim, do you have anything else to say to the folks at home?
Be sure to drink your Ovaltine.
That's good advice, and I think that's what we're going to end it on, because that's been the point of the whole episode. Honestly, it's an Ovaltine ad.
It really has.
You thought it was an ad for my book, which it wasn't, but it was even more so an Ovaltine ad.
Ovaltine.
So that'll wrap it up for this edition of the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. We thank you so much for being here, and we hope you'll join us again next week. Until next time,
I'm Tim Van Orden.
And I'm Kevin Sinise. And as Jesus said in John 10:10, he really did live long and prosper.
See you next time.